My name is Willard Manus, and I am the playwright of A Journal of the Plague Year. I adapted the play from the book by Daniel Defoe of the same name. Defoe, as most of you probably know, is the author of Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders. My adaptation of Defoe's book runs 1 hour, and it has two main characters. HF, a businessman, his best friend, a doctor, and he has a neighbor that he has a love affair with, Hilda Perkins. And then there are three other actors who play a variety of roles with different voices in a very creative, exciting way. And again, my interest is in showing that even in the midst of a tragedy like the pandemic, noble things can come out of the human heart, along with the sad things, death and illness. Well, I can remember going to the theater in New York when I was 15. They had something called the Subway Circuit in New York. Plays visited the suburbs and so on, playing mostly in movie houses, I guess. Anyway, the first play I saw was Ladies' Night at the Turkish Bath, and I've been a theater fan ever since. Well, I didn't write so many plays early in my writing career. I concentrated mostly on fiction. I've published a bunch of novels. And then in the 60s and 70s, I ended up living on a Greek island, which was a long way away from the theater. So I really didn't get serious about playwriting until I came to Los Angeles in 1979. I guess it's the cliche, it's a live experience. It's happening in real time right in front of you. And if there's a real connection between audience and actors, it's a wonderful thing. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, it's very exciting and very fulfilling. In the middle of the pandemic, I spotted the book, A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe on my bookshelf, and I just picked it up to read it, being that a pandemic was in full swing. And halfway through the book, I realized it could make a play. So that's when I started thinking of a stage work. Well, I haven't really adapted many books. I think this is the first one. So I don't have a tried and true formula, but you read it again and again, and try to take something out of it, a construction that will work on stage. Defoe's book, by the way, was not a novel. It was a nonfiction account of the pandemic that hit London in 1664. And so a fair amount of creativity was involved. I had to expand characters, expand relationships, come up with new relationships. I mean, essentially, the 70% of the book is there and 30% is invention. Well, a pandemic is a pandemic. It's a universal experience. It's people facing a terrible calamity. In those days, they didn't have so much scientific knowledge behind them. They were completely bewildered, had no idea where this plague was coming from and why it was happening to them. Defoe was 5 years old when the plague hit London. He didn't write this book until about 20 years later. I think he saw another pandemic approaching England and decided to write this book as a kind of warning, cautionary warning to people out there. He's a businessman who has only initials, HF, and he's an amateur historian, and his account of the play comes out of the walks he took through the city, mostly to go to his shop. He was a saddler, but also he just took walks around the city to make notes and with the intention of writing a book about it, which he eventually did. Basically, it's a portrait of people who are embattled, facing terrible strange mystery, a disease that had no idea what caused it at that time, and they had no idea why it was striking them at that time. So it's a portrait of people under extreme pressure, like people in war, bombed out cities and so on, reacting to this terrible, terrible occurrence. Of course, I hope it's a powerful dramatic experience, but also we're repeating many of the things that happened in the plague. And I think there are things to be learned from the reactions and the actions in 1664 to today. One thing to be stressed, my production is a radio play. It would have been nice to have a big theater company behind it with 15, 20 actors involved and a big set and lots of costumes and so on. But that wasn't possible at this time. So the most practical way to approach the problem was to turn it into a radio play. So the actors in the show have script in hand, but there is a music and soundtrack. And, I believe it works well that way. It's an intimate way to connect with the audience, but they're not seeing a big full production. I think to take some courage in the fact that the pandemics do terrible things, but do pass, and that it is possible to survive and go on to a decent life, which is the case with HF. He comes through that terrible experience, and his last words, I alive. That's his last shout out to the audience. Well, again, to learn how people reacted to a pandemic and a different time. Also, the play is not completely gloomy. There was a lot of humor. There's a love story, and there's humor and some music and so on. So it is a stage piece. And whatever you get out of going to the theater, I hope you'll get from this production as a radio play. A Journal of the Plague Year is about cheating fate, getting the better of circumstances, and surviving. People are caught in a tragedy, but there is a way out. And all facets of humanity, from the horrible things that people do to each other to the noble things, come out in a pandemic, as we know. And certainly that's represented in my play. At least that's what I was going for. Before the pandemic, there were probably at least 150 small theaters in Los Angeles. That's in addition to the handful of large theaters which are doing big equity productions. And for the most part, if you wanted to see something unusual, offbeat, experimental, you would go to a small theater like the Brickhouse. You would not find that kind of play, for the most part, in the larger theaters in LA. Most of them produce plays that have been done in New York or maybe Chicago and were commercially successful. They very rarely take a chance on a local playwright. It's one of their big weaknesses and one of the sad things about LA theater. But the strength and the vitality of modern theater was to be found in the small theater circuit. Now, a lot of those theaters have shut down because of the pandemic. I assume most of them will reopen, but not yet. The Brickhouse is one of the few that is up and running again. My name is Willard Manus, and I am the playwright of A Journal of the Plague Year. I adapted the play from the book by Daniel Defoe of the same name. Defoe, as most of you probably know, is the author of Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders. And he was one of the famous British playwright, well, not playwrights, but writers of his time. It's a stage play. It's more than a reading, but I certainly hope to see people there. Performances are Saturday night at 8 o'clock and Sunday at 3 until December 19th. And I think if people come, they'll be touched and moved and entertained as well.